And welcome back, guys, to another recap of the Tata Steel Chess Tournament 2026. Round number 2 was yesterday, and once again, there were many interesting games, not only in the Master section, but also in the Challengers. But of course, I had to record a video on this Rook Endgame between Norbek Abdusattorov having the white pieces and Praggnanandhaa having the black pieces. It started again with a pretty slow Carlsbad structure, like in the video we had, or in the game we analyzed yesterday. And Norbek grinded out an advantage very nicely and then got into this endgame, which is already a pretty good version for white. And as if you are more familiar with my channel, you probably know that we went through all of those theoretical Rook endgames starting a couple of weeks ago, and we started exactly with this one where 3 versus 3 and white has the extra d pawn. You can also find it on my channel with an extra c pawn, with an extra b pawn, and with an extra a pawn. I'm going to make a playlist with all of those Rook endgames, so you can check it out easily there and find all of the videos. And I know that this sounds or it is a bit of a strange thing to say, but if Pragg would have watched my video, maybe he did, but if he would have studied it carefully, maybe the game would have ended differently, because he lost this Rook endgame, even though it is still a draw. Of course, such a tough tournament, you play a very long game, anything can happen there. But the one thing which I said in this video, that the best defensive setup in this endgame is to have the king on e6 or on d6 and to play f6, would have also been the case here. But Pragg did not go for it. He was probably looking for a more forced solution to hold this endgame. And he went for the immediate move, rook to g2, which goes after the g3 pawn. But after that, it's already, maybe it's even lost already. At least black is going to have a very difficult time to defend it now. And like in the video which where we analyzed this, king e6 would have been the best defense here. And the idea is, I mean, you don't necessarily even have to go for f6, but with what we looked at previously, for example, once white starts marching with the king to f4 with some ideas of king g5, then usually it's a good idea for black to just stop it, go f6, and even though it looks weakening, as we analyzed in the Rook endgame video, there's actually no great way for white to go after the pawn on g6. And the king will always stay close to the f6 pawn, so therefore it's going to be difficult for white to make any more progress here. I've analyzed one concrete line, which was maybe not even possible in the endgame, which we looked at, because white does have a decent version here, is rook b6 check, king to e7, and now king to d5. Which is not always possible in this endgame, because often if black can get it, there's a rook on a3, for example, or a rook on the 5th rank, which would not allow white's king inside like this. But even here, it is still a draw, and there are a couple of ways for, I mean, not many, but now black could go after the pawns with rook a3. This is one idea. Since king c6 can always be answered by rook c3 at the right time, you could even take, and after d5, then well, now rook f6 is even there, which will lead to a winning pawn endgame. After taking, then king d6 will come, picking up the pawn on d5, and black is winning. So there, white is just not fast enough. I've analyzed rook b7 check, king f6, king c6, rook takes f3, and now it is sort of a race, but black is just very fast here with g5 to come, and black cannot really be worse here. It's just going to be a draw. h4, the rook can sacrifice itself for the d pawn at the right time, and white also has to sacrifice the rook for the h pawn sooner or later. Yeah, I've also looked at rook a5 here, just out of curiosity, if this is still a draw, and I thought it's a nice motive to point out that black is still saving this, but only with the move king e6. Otherwise, if white gets d5, then it would be lost already. But king e6 prevents d5, and if king c7 check, then king to e7, and I didn't see a great way for white to make any progress. Once the rook starts going here with the idea of rook e3 check to cut off the king, then black still has rook a7 check and king c6, rook a6 check, forcing back the king or forcing it to the b file. And once it goes to the b file, then again, rook e3 is not really a check, because the king can once again go to d6. But I believe that rook a3 is kind of the solution which you're hoping for here. Rook g2 I think was another possibility, which is even more forcing, not even allowing white to go back with the king, because after rook a3 he could potentially go back and yeah, continue pressing for a little bit more. I think after rook g2 is more or less of a forced draw already, again with similar ideas that here black is going to be fine in this race. But in the game, rook g2 was played by Pragg, and now after f4, as I said, it's already a very difficult situation for black, probably already lost, because black cannot stop the white king from entering. He did so at least momentarily with the move king e6, otherwise white would get king d5, and then maybe rook e3, cutting off the king, after which it's lost. So king e6, d5 check was played now, king d6, rook b6 check, king e7. Noribek gave check and went back, and now he had the correct breakthrough with move f5. This is the problem for black here. Otherwise, if it wouldn't be for this f5, I'm not sure if white actually has a way of winning here. I think this might be what Pragg missed when he played rook g2 earlier. But after f5, white is kind of creating another weakness, because if black just leaves it like this, like let's say he goes for a move like rook g1, then this pawn on g6 can always be targeted, maybe even with ideas like king f4 to g5, and yeah, black is going to lose. So Pragg tried taking on f5, king takes f5, but now another weakness is there, namely the pawn on h5, and also white's king is now able to enter because the pawn on g6 is not controlling the f5 square anymore. Rook d2, rook e3 check, king to f8, and rook e5, another precise move, just protecting the pawn on d5, and the rook is placed nicely on the 5th rank. Rook d4, and now king f6, the only move, otherwise white would be in Zugzwang, because if king g5, rook g4, with those trades happening, I don't think white has any more chances to win the game. But king f6 works nicely, there's no check on f4, rook d3, and only now he took on h5, because rook takes g3, there's going to be rook h8, which leads to a winning pawn endgame. And after rook f3 check, which was played in the game, king e5, rook takes g3. Now we again have the same scenario like earlier, but what we've seen here is that the king is cut off on the h file. And in the game, the king was already very active, and it ran to d6, after which the pawn on d5 will also be supported. Let's see how the game finished. Rook a3 came, rook to e5, cutting off the king, so that it has to stay on f8. f6, rook e1 all the way back, very natural, rook h3, and now Noribek even sacrificed the pawn on h4 because this endgame is winning. There's no way to stop the d-pawn. Rook c4 check and king d5, and here he resigned, because if the rook goes somewhere, just d7 will come. Rook d2 check, king c6, another check, and then you can, for example, run out here. I guess also something else like king e6 should probably be enough to win, and then something like this. But I just showed this here because rook e8 is actually the easiest winning idea. Rook c2 check, king b5, and the king will just slowly run back. Actually, now there's rook b8. Hang on. Maybe you should instead go to e6 anyway. Maybe that's the easiest. I'm now just thinking, I guess you can also go here or here. King c4 might be an idea. Yeah, king c4, and if rook b8, then king c5. Now going back, and the rook is now passive. If the rook goes back, there's just promoting, and otherwise the king will come here. But yeah, also earlier king e6 seems like a very simple solution, maybe even easier. Anyway, that was my recap from round number 2 of Tata Steel. Again, there were many interesting games, but this one stood out to me since we talked about those Rook endgames. I think my channel in the meantime is already kind of known for all of these Rook endgames, which I like. I think that's a good development. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you found it instructive. Let me know if you did see that game, and if you also thought about my video series here. Again, the best defensive setup for black is to go king e6, then f6, after which black of course still needs to be precise, but yeah, this is the way to go here. So thank you guys for watching, and I'm gonna see you guys soon.